Thank you for being here. Johannes Lin has been a pioneer of scaling up in development since he left the bank and worked with Wolfenson for many years. Wolfenson started, I remember, in Shanghai, thinking about the Scaling Up Conference, 2004. He realized that there were so many important things happening, but they were not really scaling. And then when you left the bank, you continued working with him and published this book that Brookings has that I use as a reference for the course that I teach. So I am very happy that you are with us today.
Thank you, Isabel. I'm happy because I always like to talk about my favorite topic.
So tell me, at a personal level, what made you connect with the topic of scaling up?
Well, you mentioned Jim Wolfenson. So I think the first time I really stumbled over the problem was that, or the opportunity, I should say, was that he had visited Georgia, the country Georgia. I was at that time as vice president of the World Bank for Europe and Central Asia. He came back and he said, Johannes, I visited a wonderful rural development project in Georgia. And when I asked the country director who accompanied me, how many farmers are benefiting from this project, he said, well, about 1,500. And I said, well, that's a great number, Jim said. But now tell me, how many farmers in Georgia could benefit from a project like this? And she said, oh, well, I don't know, maybe 50, 60,000. And Jim said to her, so what are we doing to reach those 50,000 with this kind of an intervention? He said, oh, well, we're really moving on to other projects. Somebody will pick it up. It's such a good project. Somebody will pick it up. So he wasn't very happy about that. That sort of stubbed my toe on it, I think, the first time. And then, of course, he went off and organized this big conference with China. And by the way, China, of course, for him was the sort of the big example of how to do scaling. Because the Chinese have this long-standing practice of piloting lots of different approaches to address a problem. And then when they think they found the right intervention, they scale it up very systematically. So he was very impressed with the Chinese example and wanted to, in a sense, bring that to the world and see it replicated elsewhere. So he organized the conference, but then, of course, he retired, and guess what happened? His successor, Paul Wolfowitz, he wanted a new broom, so he swept all the old stuff out, and of course, scaling up went out the door, and he had other priorities and so on. So Jim then came to Brookings and said, I want a development center, Wolfenson Development Center. I'll fund it for 5 years. And one of the topics we should focus on is scaling up. And he asked me to run the center, set it up and run it. And we focused from then on. I focused because I thought it was really a terrific topic. And looking back on my career in the World Bank and beyond, I felt I hadn't thought enough about it. So I wanted to think hard and wherever possible actually do something about it.
And both you and him were so ahead of the times.
Well, it's interesting because, when we started the center at Brookings in 2005, there were already a couple of other people, including Larry Cooley, whom I believe you interviewed, but also Ruth Simmons, who at the same time pioneered this, and basically we moved in parallel.
Amazing.
And after about 2 or 3 years into our work, Ruth actually was a bit ahead of us. And there were some previous, actually, interesting enough, there had actually been a couple of papers on scaling up and actually literature that we then reviewed and pulled together in our work in Brookings. So there was a bit of a track record. Of course, I don't know whether you're old enough to remember McNamara at the bank. I mean, McNamara was the scaler upper par excellence. That was his, he was always, so the World Bank had a sense of history, but it had gotten lost between McNamara and Wolfenson. Wolfenson picked it up and then sort of ran with it for a while. We then picked it up at the Wolfenson Center, but in parallel there were quite a few others who were also working on it. But the mainline development finance agencies had not really focused on it yet. And this is frankly the big change today, that after sort of 15 years, now actually a lot of organizations that we work with are really looking at this very carefully and trying to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. So after all this research and involvement and looking at cases, you came with a definition of scaling up which was what?
Well, yeah, actually we picked up somebody else's definition, but I liked it, and so we ran with it. Let me read it for you.
Yes,
It's a little, it's not heavy, but it's important. Each word sort of means something. So scaling up means expanding, replicating, adapting, and sustaining successful policies. So it's not just projects. Policies, programs, or projects in geographic space and over time to reach a greater number of people. Now, a definition, this is a very generic definition. Then if you're an organization that deals principally with farmers, like the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD in Rome, you focus presumably on farmers and want to reach the maximum number of farmers. Or if you're somebody into nutrition, then you're into children, for example, like UNICEF, or just yesterday I talked extensively to Save the Children about scaling up. They, of course, look, so if you have a particular target group, for example, as an organization, then of course you want to adapt your definition to sort of make sure. Or if you're an environmental agency, your target may actually be an environmental
So that's a
goal.
very condensed and complete definition. Yeah, I like it. Yeah. So at Imago, or in my classes also, I always say, and it's a little bit controversial, that there are only two pathways to scale. One pathway is to scale through the government, which is it's an amazing capacity and resources, and another pathway is to scale through the market, where you need a business model, your value chain, and I always say that what you need to scale is resources, and you need people and capacity, as well as money, and that the donors are not a pathway to scale. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that, maybe with two provisos. One that actually, what we call in the book that you mentioned earlier, we actually talk about hybrid pathways. And frankly, from my experience, it's actually the two, government and markets, very often have to work together and interact in ways that support the pathway. So the pure, sure, you have pretty much pure commercial pathways. I mean, take book publication, or take the cell phones, for example. But even there's usually some kind of government regulation or policies
or
and
R&D.
so on. R&D. So so almost in every area. Or if you have education, take public education, public schooling. I mean, there are private providers that provide inputs. The textbooks, for example, are usually provided by private and printed and even designed and whatever by private firms. So you have to actually, in almost all pathways, one way or another, you have to work together. So that, to my mind, is important to remember. Now, there was one other point you mentioned. You sort of reminded me of, but it's now.
So there's one I was summarizing, preparing for a class. Your first chapter, I think, is the overview chapter, and it talked about the fact that the private sector does scaling very well, but it doesn't work with the poor. The government doesn't have the implementation capacity to scale, and the donors don't implement. And so that's why scaling up is such a challenge. Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think you're right. The governments, of course, one has to differentiate a bit. If you think about the careers of this world, I mean, they have a lot of capacity, and if the politics is right, they can reach the poor at the level needed. But even in this country, of course, the U.S., we fall short in reaching the poor. So it isn't just that capacity is always the constraint, but yes, it is for the government's capacity, and by the way, it's political, if you will, political will, which one can include under capacity. It is institutional organizational capacity, and of course it's financial capacity, and the lower you go in the income, sort of per capita income level in developing countries, that often, and of course in fragile states, the capacity constraints tend to be more severe. And you're right, in many ways the private sector doesn't reach the poor, at least it doesn't reach the poor with the right solutions. Take water, potable water. So, the private sector actually will provide potable water to the poor by trucks, whatever, water sales private water salespeople.
Informal sector, yes.
Informal sector, but the water is actually per liter bought is incredibly expensive, much more expensive than if you had a proper water line into the house of that person. So the private sector is there, but it's actually not a solution that is effective. The water isn't high quality, and it's actually very expensive. So this is where private sector, in terms of standard solution, was private education, private health. That's of course high quality. Private transport and so on doesn't reach the poor, and so the challenge then becomes to find ways and means, including through social enterprises, that of course you in Imago support so extraordinarily well. That then becomes to some extent an opportunity for social enterprise to step up to the challenge and bridge between the private sector solutions, the public sector solutions, and fill a gap.
Great, good. So now moving into the donor side,
Right.
which is going to be the main focus of the interview. So I always wondered, and I don't have an answer, and I wonder whether you have it. When Wolfenson started this development marketplace, there were so many innovations that came out and that got awards and all that, but none of them was ever scaled within a project of the bank. So what is it about scaling innovation and organizations like the World Bank that is so difficult?
Yeah, I guess for the World Bank specifically, you have a problem. Actually, it's maybe a very good example. I hadn't thought about this so far, but you remind me of it. So, we sometimes talk about the missing middle. We talk about the valley of death between a good idea and innovation and actually scaled up impact. And so you had in the market development marketplace, and I hope everybody knows what that's about, but it's a sort of competition that the World Bank organized for inventors of good ideas with development impact, usually small little projects. They all came together. They were giving rewards for best idea and so on.
And money.
And
and
money
$250,000.
rewards. So it was actually a great idea to encourage innovation. And this is where the problem comes in. It focused squarely on innovation as a method to sort of foster and incentivize ideas, but it did not as an institution, the development marketplace did not focus, okay, if this thing works, how do we then actually take it from small scale to maybe medium scale to bigger scale? And so this transition from small to large scale implementation was never, institutionally by the World Bank, was never addressed. Now the World Bank in its projects works generally at large scale. It doesn't necessarily get it right every time, but it works at pretty large scale. The development marketplace was at very little scale, and there was no internal effort made to systematically foster a link and a transmission belt, if I may say so, between the small scale innovations and the large scale application and instruments that the World Bank has. Now this is actually where organizations like, and I was just talking yesterday to Save the Children, for example, or in the public domain, IFAD, a relatively small agricultural international financial institution for agriculture, they may actually play a role because their projects are relatively small. They can pick up and work with relatively small, innovative projects, bring them to sort of a medium, let's call it a medium-sized scale, for example, in a district in India rather than countrywide, as IFAD actually did with some poverty programs, that then hand them off to the World Bank. So you have these potential intermediary institutions that can help bridge this gap, the missing middle, or the valley of death, as I said, that can help bridge this gap. And this is where actually smaller and medium-sized development agencies, I think, have a real role to play. It isn't only the big ones like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or the big bilateral USAID. It's also these small and medium-sized aid organizations actually, I believe, have a very important facilitating and bridging role to play.
Yeah.
But then the important thing is that they actually work with the larger organizations and, of course, work with governments, or where appropriate, work with market institutions to hand off at the end of their projects.
So remember these learning and innovation loans that were maximum of $5 million, and were supposed to actually be doing what these smaller projects could do in terms of testing innovations, much easier to fail, take risks, and only if they work, then they would be scaled. And for some of us, we love them, but they didn't last around long. They were eventually killed when Wolfenson left. So do you think there's something in the nature of a larger institution that this type of littles don't sit well, and they really naturally align with an intermediate-sized institution?
I think so, because a large organization like the World Bank, basically its business model is based on containing overall administrative costs by working with large projects. So per dollar lent, the bank is actually, World Bank, compared to an organization like IFAD, is actually quite efficient and can cover its administrative costs by the loan charges, but only because it makes these big loans. IFAD, for example, de facto has to subsidize even its loans where it charges the same rate as the World Bank. It has to subsidize the administrative cost because the loans are much smaller. So this is actually precisely a good example of sort of value of death and where you have to bridge, because these intermediate size activities, from small scale innovative to large scale impact initiatives, they usually require some kind of subsidy, some kind of somebody willing, through grants or through subsidized loans or some other financing mechanism, willing to actually maintain the momentum from small, innovative to large, broad impact. And so this is where the smaller, medium-sized aid agencies actually that are sustain themselves because they have grants and substantial are able to play a very important role, in my view.
Wonderful. So going into IFAD,
Right.
which I saw you've worked a lot with them, and with Arna as well.
Right.
And so just reading their material, they are amazing at thinking about scaling in a way that I don't think I ever saw inside the bank. Might be because you guys were working with them, but tell me a little bit about how the scaling thinking happens inside the organization and how widespread it is.
Well, maybe just a little history. So actually IFAD, partly I think because it realized as a smaller organization to justify itself, it actually sort of had to think about, so we don't only do relatively small projects, but actually we have greater impact, we are catalytic and so on. So back already in around 2000, the year 2000, IFAD sort of started in its mission statements and its strategy, high-level strategies, talking about catalytic impact at scale, replicating, and so on. It then became a more explicit focus, at least as I understand it, when we reached out, we from Brookings, where we've been working with Jim Wolfenson, scaling up, to Kevin Cleaver, who at that point was operational vice president and an old friend of ours from the World Bank days. He was the operational vice president at IFAD, and we said, hey, Kevin, would you like to work with us to sort of, in a sense, incubate this idea of scaling up, pilot our ideas of scaling up? Can we work with you and with IFAD on this? And he said, oh, that's great, because it's exactly what I would like to do. And so we worked with him and his teams for actually about 3 years in 2 stages. First, exploratory. We looked at basically all the mission statement strategies, the operational policies, the operational processes, the staffing incentives, management incentives, the training and so on, to see to what extent, if at all, scaling was part of it. Turned out, even though at the highest institutional level, scaling and catalytic and so on was actually in their goals, it hadn't actually very effectively worked in a systematic way into the institutional infrastructure, if you wish. And therefore, of course, it didn't come as a surprise that even though IFAD had some good examples, Peru is actually one, rural development, the highland development programs of IFAD, actually an excellent case of scaling up, but it wasn't done systematically across the whole range. So we then provided IFAD, that was the Brookings team, but we worked closely with colleagues in IFAD. We provided them with, if you wish, some sort of basic framework, analysis of what they've done to date, and some recommendations of how they might move forward in actually applying it, including putting together some guidelines for actually the operational staff, training for their, again, staff, but also consultants, by the way, very important, and ideally also training for the counterparts in the countries. And we suggested that they actually look at their various business lines, irrigation, rural credit, climate change, nutrition, and so on. Look at these various business lines, and in each of these areas, figure out what are some of the scaling lessons and experiences and opportunities that we should systematically pursue. Now, that all was actually over a fairly extended period, about 5 to 7 years, was actually done then, followed up by party consultants, by internal staff, and in the end, they ended up by 2016-17 with quite a good, what I call, institutional infrastructure for supporting the staff and the management in the field with scaling up. So then, very importantly, 2 more factors. I should mention, IFAD, like IDA and other concessional funds, every 3 or 4 years have to go back to their donors to get more money for their projects. Replenishments, exactly. So in the first replenishment that I was involved in as the facilitator at the time, management put forward this idea to the donors that we will be pursuing scaling up as our institutional mandate and comparative advantage. Well, the donors liked it, but then 3 years later, the next replenishment, they came back and asked, so what have you done? So it was actually a very good accountability mechanism to keep IFAD focused on it, because, like everything else, scaling up can be a fad, and so, comes, goes. So because of this accountability mechanism of the replenishments, and they had to report on what they had actually done in terms of their scaling up practices, that was an important factor.
Fascinating. Were they scaling up?
What?
No.
No. The second element that then in 2017, an independent evaluation was done on scaling up. And very important, because another accountability mechanism.
Yes.
It found that, yes, IFAD has done a lot of stuff in terms of sort of institutional infrastructure for scaling, but it had actually not yet effectively and systematically reached the front lines. And so more had to be done, clearly, to actually especially train, but also through the process of project reviews and management and so on, and maybe the templates by which the projects were reviewed. Much more has to be done to actually take it into the front lines. So IFAD, despite its very explicit focus and its long-term engagement on this, has not necessarily yet reached where it should be and wants to be, is my impression. So. But it's a good example of how long it takes and how systematically one has to keep at it.
Yeah, so IFAD was only thinking of scaling within its project, but it was not scaling itself as an organization. Did I get that right?
It's interesting you should say that. It was, first of all, IFAD itself doesn't scale. The really important thing to remember is that these aid organizations, in a sense, are a facilitating intermediary to help governments or the private sector, where appropriate, to scale. So in each case, the aid agency shouldn't scale itself, but should see itself as a facilitator of scaling. That's the first point. The second point is that IFAD did grow. This was between the replenishment that, basically because of the food crisis in 2008, 2009. IFAD got a lot more money, so that led to about a 50% increase in its operational size, meaning more money lent. Then it further increased in the last 5 to 10 years by actually using the equity that's in IFAD because of past loans that had been repaid to then actually go and borrow money against that equity from governments. And now it's moving, actually, it's planning to move into markets to borrow money by selling bonds, by issuing bonds, And that could allow it to actually double its size. So it's doing two things at the same time, and actually these two, to some extent, are somewhat different scaling up processes. One is you scale up your own operations as an institution and reach more people. The other process is that through your operational and business model, for a given amount of money, you manage to reach more people by having partners, by actually using your money to and your influence to change policies or whatever the mechanisms are that you're well aware of.
So you mentioned that IFAD, after all this investment and commitment and accountability mechanisms, still hasn't sorted out the last mile.
Right, exactly.
So
actually,
why do you think it is so difficult?
I think it's really, to me, it's ironic actually that, over the last few decades in the development business, we've got so focused on results. And we've got now, RCTs, and we've got, evidence-based, the impact analysis, and we've got so focused on this that we now basically insist that every project has to have results. Now we measure results in terms of the impact of the project on whatever the goal is, people, taking people out of poverty or raising yields. But it's very project focused and in a sense, very short term. We need to demonstrate, again, to the donors who fund it, maybe to the government, so on, that this project works. That gets in the way of actually thinking longer term and with a broader vision of what are the factors needed, what are the enabling conditions required to actually make the intervention sustainable and scalable. And so instead of focusing on, are we getting the right partners? Do we have the right longer-term financing mechanism? Are we bringing costs down? Are we keeping it simple enough so that actually the government ultimately, or whoever can take it over, we load everything onto a project that just to make it work. And of course, put in our best, hopefully our best people and so on. But we're not really thinking about whether at the end it's replicable, scalable, sustainable, and scalable.
And why do you think it's
that? I guess it's because, in a way, and it's great, we have become very results oriented, and that's a good thing. But we have to make sure we don't look only at one set of results, but we need to look at the broader set of results. And I guess it's in maybe human, if you wish, it's human nature in one way, meaning that, if I'm a project manager, I want to make sure my project works. And then, of course, I move on to other projects very often and very likely. I want to be sure, and again, that's a good thing, that I can demonstrate that this idea works if I'm the innovator in charge of the project. But do I necessarily ask the question, what happens when the project is finished? No, it's not. It doesn't seem, and it's a very good question why, and frankly, maybe I should think more about it. But, at the same time, I have to say, thinking about scaling up and thinking about what happens after the project finishes. And for example, doing midterm review of a project, which is a very typical practice, not only ask what do we need to do to finish the project and get its short-term results, if you wish, but also what happens after the project. It's not rocket science, but somehow we need to change mindsets and we need to change incentives.
I agree.
And this is where management and donors and so on are critically important.
And
this is
where
the governance and the authorizing environment is really critical.
Yeah. So Larry Cooley always says, and it really resonates with us because of what we see with our clients, that scaling up is a transformation. It's a process that takes 3 to 5 years in an organization or longer in development. And some of these results, even though the project might have a lifespan of 5 years, some of these results are 10 years, 15 years if you think about microfinance. So do you think that the fact that scaling up is a transformational challenge is part of the reason that it's so difficult to get there?
I'm sure it's part of the reason. And I guess one also has to think, of course, of winners and losers. And usually when you And it's interesting, for example, think about Brock and Grameen Bank.
Yep.
It's very interesting. When they got really big, they became political threats to the political environment which they operate in.
Yes.
Exactly. So, they're usually, if it could be political, it could be, that take the water sellers, in the poor neighborhoods that don't have water connection. Well, if you bring the water in, it's actually the water sellers will lose out. Now, this is not a very good example, perhaps, in terms of a general problem, winners and losers.
You would be disrupting something.
Exactly, you're disrupting. So whenever you try to introduce changes and new at scale, when they're little, nobody cares very much. But once they get bigger, the antibodies grow, and so the reaction and resistance can and often does grow. Or it can be just, people are jealous. Well, why are they getting this and we're not? And so, it can be positive because let's also do it, and that, of course, demand creates demand for scaling. But it can also be an antibody that says, no, they're getting something, we're not getting it, so let's oppose it. So it's in the political domain is one very important obstacle.
So very related to that, when you think about development and donors, how do you assess whether a project is scalable? What are the things that you're thinking about to assess?
Well, that actually Larry Cooley and Ruth Simmons, who I mentioned earlier, have very good assessment tools that are sort of basic questions.
Yes.
In Larry's case, I think it's 40 questions.
Yeah, but very organizational.
It's very organizational. To my mind, it's actually all revolves around, it isn't so much is it scalable, in many cases it isn't so much is it scalable or not, and actually Larry will emphasize that also. It's not a yes or no. It's actually defining what I call the drivers or obstacles that can drive the scaling up process forward, and you have to make sure you try to, whichever way, put them in place, and we can talk about what kind of drivers. Well, what are the obstacles that have to be removed? Alternatively, thinking more positively, what are the spaces we have to create so something can grow? Political space, fiscal space, institutional space, cultural space, actually, environmental space in agriculture. Do we actually have enough water to sustain an irrigation system or whatever? So making sure as you look at a solution, an innovation or an intervention, ask yourself, what if we want this to grow beyond this one-off project? What are the possible, who can drive, who are the champions, where are the incentives, where are the markets, where are the communities that can sort of ask for it, where are the external agents that we can mobilize, partners and so on. In terms of the spaces, how do we bring costs down? How do we mobilize the budget finance or get cost recovery in the project so that it actually becomes sustainable and replicable? How do we mobilize or make sure political opposition gets taken care of? By the way, when you talk to, fascinating, when you talk to Santiago Levy about Progressa, he thought from day one about the how to make sure, number one, that Progressa survived the political cycle of presidential elections, but also how to actually manage, deal with potential bureaucratic and political opposition.
And the losers, the tortilla producers.
Right. Yeah. So I think
it's super complex.
And by the way, to my mind, Progressa is, and Santiago's book is one of the best examples of a very well thought through and analyzed scaling process. It's worth looking at.
Wonderful. Again. So to end up in a high note, tell me about another. I absolutely agree. On policy, absolutely, opportunities is like a textbook case of how to do it well. Any other examples that you have seen that they've really done it well? And
you're looking now for examples of scaling up supported by
whatever comes to mind to you.
Well, okay, since we're talking about Peru, and we've been talking about IFAD, so one of my favorite examples of successful scaling up is the Peruvian Altiplano farmer development program, farming community development program. And so basically over 30 years, IFAD supported, first in a relatively small geographic area of southern Peru, supported Altiplano farmer development with a fairly simple rural credit scheme. It then moved to another area, staying still engaged, did a second geographic area and added components, including community engagement, women's weaving development components, and so on. It did this over a period of 30 years, covered a large fraction, not everybody, of the Altiplano communities,
wow.
And finally ended up with the government taking it over, doing it on a countrywide basis as appropriate in the highlands, and bringing in other donors, including, I believe, the Inter-American Development Bank and GIZ from Germany to help them. So it's actually, it shows long-term commitment. It also very interesting in terms of the institutional frame, because initially it wasn't actually strong, didn't have strong government ownership, but it had very strong community ownership, strong community demand, and a strong group of academics and civil society supporters who together with IFAD designed the original idea, adapted it over time, and took it to scale. There's another very interesting example which I find fascinating is the UNDP has a program of supporting female circumcisions, to stop female circumcision in Egypt. And they started at the community level, again, like in the case of Peru, working actually with civil society and academics and some medical personnel, and then got into the government, got a law passed that actually outlawed the practice, but then didn't stop. And very importantly, from my perspective, that so often in the World Bank days, we get a law passed, great, move on. Yes. They actually then supported the follow-up process, including the prosecution of personnel that's continued the practice, and supported the implementation process of trying to stop it. Now it's interesting, last night I was just mentioned this example to Save the Children representatives, and there was a lady there who apparently knows Egypt and said, you're right, this was actually a very good program, but it's actually gotten stuck. And guess why? Because the political and the cultural opposition was so strong that apparently it's plateaued at a level where the practice is still very prevalent. And so it just shows, I'm not sure UNDP could have done anything else, but better, maybe it could have, but it's, scaling is not an easy task.
Not at all.
But it's the idea that you don't just, work at the local level, but you actually vertically scale up, as we call it. You go into the policy, legal, and then you don't stop with the law, but you actually follow up to make sure the law is implemented. I mean, that is, to my mind, is a very good example of how one needs to think about scaling.
And how you're thinking. So what I'm getting from what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're thinking of this valley of death, or this missing middle, where there's like a value chain of different actors that can come at different moments.
Right.
And you see smaller organizations like IFAD sort of in the continuum after, let's say, social enterprises or grassroots innovation, then come the smaller, and only then can you think about the larger organizations. Can you think this is the value?
I'd be careful not to say only, but I think in many cases, having intermediary organizations, by the way, Larry and his framework talks about a lot about intermediary organizations. Exactly, we need almost always some kind of intermediary organizations. They can be, sometimes maybe the World Bank can be that, but actually intermediary organizations are often smaller, and they may actually even be at the local level, meaning nationally organized, and not only international organizations. But yes, to interact effectively with a social enterprise or a relatively small national NGO, World Bank is not very well suited. IFAD is much better suited in the civil society world. Save the Children is much better suited to do that. So yes, I think there's an important niche for these smaller donors, also bilateral, smaller bilateral donors. And so what I see that is it isn't just the big organizations, governments and multilateral development banks that can support scaling up effectively. Actually, I think there's a very important role for these small and medium-sized organizations to think very hard, what is our niche, how can we be effective intermediaries, and how do we help cross the valley of death, or how can we be part of that transmission belt of good ideas in the small to large impact and ultimately SDGs.
Yeah, fantastic, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johannes.